one of Erie's most powerful women political leaders, the late Patricia J. Pat Liebel, is the focus of this program during Women's History Month. Here, a group of panelists will discuss Liebel's life and legacy, including her time served as the longtime top executive assistant and business administrator for Erie's longest-serving public leader, six-term Mayor Louis J. Tullio, as well as her time as acting mayor for the city of Erie, and how after more than 2 decades at City Hall, she went on to work for 20 years in the Mercyhurst University Alumni Office. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Speggen and I'm the vice president at the JES and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Now in this program, we'll hear a bit from each one of our panelists one by one on their connections to and time spent with Pat Liebel, and then we're going to open the floor for conversation and discussion. Now, before we get to their insights and accounts of Erie's Pat Liebel, a bit more about each one of our guests. Dr. Judith Lynch serves as a scholar in residence at the JES and was the founding chairwoman of the think tank's Board of Trustees. She was the first woman elected Erie County Executive and served in that role for 5 four-year terms, and played a critical role in developing Erie's home rule charter and served on Erie County Council. Mayor Joyce Savocchio currently serves as the JES's chairwoman of the board. Now, prior, she was the first and only woman elected mayor of the city of Erie, where she spent 3 four-year terms after having served on Erie City Council and was an esteemed educator in the region. Ms. Sheila Coon served as the Director of Marketing and Public Relations, and then with the Advancement Department as the Director of External Affairs and Government Relations at Mercyhurst University after a 29-year-long career in the publishing industry. Mr. Edwin McKean is a retired practicing attorney who's lectured and authored course books and materials for the Pennsylvania Bar Institute and for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of South Carolina on constitutional and historical topics. And Mr. Patrick Cuneo is the publications coordinator at the Jefferson Educational Society and also serves as the editor of the Journal of Erie Studies. He joined the think tank's team in 2015 after a decades-long career with the Erie Times News as an editor, a writer, and a columnist. Folks, if I read all of their accomplishments and their full bios, we'd have no room for our discussion on the life and legacy of Pat Liebel, our subject here. So I encourage you to head over to our website, jeserie.org, to learn more about each one of our panelists. And folks, before turning it over to our presenters, who will each share some insight into the life and legacy of the late Pat Liebel, a few programmatic notes. Now, since this program is first airing live on the JES Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. If you're watching or listening to a later broadcast of this event, still send us your questions, your comments to keep this conversation going and to stay engaged in JES programming. And of course, for more information about upcoming JES programs and publications, visit that website, jeserie.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Now, to get us started, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Judith Lynch, who's no stranger to our JES digital programming, having offered a series of presentations and publications exploring Erie County's elected women, videos of which are all available to stream on demand at jeserie.org, where you'll also find her various writings, all available free to download. Dr. Lynch, introduce us, please, to the life and legacy of Patricia Liebel, as we've set this in context of some of the work you've already done for us, outlining the remarkable achievements of other women in Erie County. Dr. Lynch, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and I want to thank the Jefferson for allowing us to make this presentation and also to welcome our panelists. One of the things that you have already done, and I just praise you for it, is describe Pat Liebel as a very powerful political leader. And many people perhaps in Erie, thinking of her as the assistant or administrator for the city of Erie, would not think of her as being so absolutely in tune with the needs of the city and so powerful in obtaining and making those needs a real item. So it is with great deal of kind of tenacity that we salute Pat Liebel today. I just want to say that you have already pointed out that we have done a number of stories on the elected women officials of Erie County. We really left that in the 1970s, and the reason why it was discontinued is that we had the COVID lockdown and the Erie County Library, which was our resource to do research, was closed. And so this is, in a sense, turning now to somebody who was not an elected official, but who was a powerful political leader in our community, Pat Liebel. Pat was not an elected official. She was a political woman, but we know that Pat Liebel did run for elected office. In Lou Tullio's last term, his 6th term, he knew that he would not be going to run for a 7th term. And so he supported Pat Liebel in the Democratic primary. That the person who defeated her in that primary was Mayor Joyce Savocchio, who is here. But that is not to say that she was not really very attuned to the political elements of the area, and particularly of the city of Erie. Now, if we look at her background, and I'm just going to very quickly go through this, and that is in the 1960s, Pat Liebel served on the Erie School District as the Erie's assistant budget administrator, and her boss was Louis J. Tullio. Tullio, when he was elected mayor, convinced her to move to the city of Erie and become his administrative assistant. And she remained that until 1989, when, of course, Mayor Tullio was in his last term, his 6th term. Pat ran for mayor, as I've already described. She was defeated, but that still did not really reduce her political accusativeness. On November the 10th, Tullio resigned because of his illness, but he turned the reins of the city of Erie over to Pat Liebel, and she served as acting mayor for the city of Erie from about November until January, when Mayor Joyce took over. In 1990, Pat Liebel was made Director of Alumni Affairs at Mercyhurst, and that's kind of a accumulation of Pat Liebel's career. It really doesn't say very much about her tenacity, her loyalness, her capability to put budgets together to secure all of the things necessary in order to make the city of Erie run in a very efficient manner. So with that, I'm turning it over to you. I could just say one more thing. Corey Villancourt, who was Tullio's biographer, and he said Tullio, a real Erie guy. Well, what we can say about Pat Liebel is she was a get it done gal, and she was able to accomplish things that probably nobody else was able to do.
And Dr. Lynch, I want to thank you for that and giving that overview to really set the context and to help us move along. And I think we're going to get into a lot of those stories once we open it for discussion and talk about her tenacity and her get it done nature and stick-to-itiveness when it came to accomplishing things in City Hall and beyond. I'd like to go to my JES colleague, Mr. Pat Cuneo. And Pat, I'm going to ask you to take your JES hat off for a second and put your Erie Times News reporting hat back on and tell us some of your connections to Pat Liebel when you were covering City Hall as a reporter, working with the administration. Take us back down that memory lane, if you would, please, Mr. Patrick Cuneo.
Well, thanks, Ben. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. I was lucky to cover Pat Liebel and the Lou Tullio administration starting a little more than 43 years ago, just yesterday. It was the late 70s. I had just graduated from college. And though I had been in and out of the county offices and the city offices and police reporting, I had never had a real beat until that time. But first things first, today's program is not just about Pat. It's about strong women. And I think we sometimes forget how very difficult it was and is for women to earn and exercise leadership roles in politics and executive posts, in private companies and corporate offices. Joyce, 3-term mayor on the heels of Tullio. Judy, 5-term county executive. And Sheila, who has worked for many years in promotions in private and education. You know, these are strong women who have overcome so much. And I think we sometimes seem to think they had advantages of women. And this story's it's the era of women. Well, you know, that's complete baloney. You know, take it from me. I covered these great ladies and others who they had to confront so much discrimination that they accomplished it. So they not only break the glass ceiling, they also you know, try to lead the way and exercise that leadership by empowering others. And then that's what Pat Liebel did. And she, though not elected, and that is an interesting distinction that Judy pointed out, she came to it in a different way. But as I was doing some research for this program, I have to point out, I had no idea just how incredibly Pat's connections to politics were. When she did an interview with Valancourt before that book in 2016, where she talked a little bit about it, how she graduated from Academy, then Mercyhurst. And then in 1953, after she graduates, she takes a job for a year with a local attorney who she didn't identify, who she absolutely loathed. He treated her horribly. She was the lowest person on the totem pole, she said. And she couldn't wait to get out of there. And so what happened? Her father runs into the attorney Nowak, who was on the school board, and he says, you know, Pat graduated from college. She's really unhappy. Do you have anything open at the school district? And he sets her up in the school district main building, and she goes to work for Art Logan. And Art Logan, who many have never even heard of, he was a true power broker in the early 50s. He had been the Democratic chairman in 48 and 49. And then he was the power of the city Democratic Party coming out of the Mayor Tom Flatley scandal. And so he was wielding a lot of power. He had 4 young teachers he mentored at Gannon. And they were Jimmy Haynes, who ended up being the city solicitor and a noted local attorney. Joe Zipper, who became the Erie School District superintendent. Art Gardner, who became mayor out of the big fight and mess after Flatley's term had to be completed. And Lou Tullio. So it just so happens that prior to what Judy just mentioned, that when Lou becomes the business administrator at the school district, Pat had already worked there for 12 years for Art Logan, who had not that, I think it was 1 year earlier, had taken a cabinet secretary job in Harrisburg. And so Lou inherits Pat as pretty much his right hand for a year at the school district. And Logan had a famous feud with Mike Canavino, Lou Tullio's, legendary rival in the 65 mayor's race. And it was Logan, it looks like, who pretty much put up, who talked Tullio into running for that mayor's race. And Pat Liebel was in there being one of the key campaigners. And so I think it just puts into perspective just how powerful she really was, and very, very humble. So when I come to cover Pat in the late 70s, man, if I had known what I know now, I would have been a heck of a lot better reporter, is for sure. Pat was, while Lou ruled the roost and was surrounded by his pictures and his incredible energy. Pat was so loyal. She sat apart from the secretaries on the 5th floor in the mayor's office, which Mayor Joyce, you obviously know this whole setup before it changed a bit under your tenure. But you had to make it into Pat's office before you could make it into Lou. And I went every single day and tried to ask my way in. Pat would take pity on me. I talked more to Pat than I ever talked to Lou. She was smart, so competent, and I can only equate it to, she was really a chief of staff. And then for 17 years, you know, she was also the budget director of the 24. She was the city, but she was always the chief of staff. She kept Lou in line and was close to the vest. One of the reasons that I talked about the powerful women and strong women on the panel today is that it's unbelievable what she had to put up with. And the 3 councilmen in particular were not only Lou's rivals, they were Pat's rivals because of it. And I think she won him over in the end, but that was Bob Brabender, Pat Capabianca, and Mario Bagnoni, who incidentally, Joyce also wrapped around her finger, which I don't know how, but they, as Pat would reminisce over the years, she talked about one incident with Bagnoni where in the private meetings before a council meeting, Pat was there representing council. He would just throw fit after fit. And he was mad about this or mad about that, and it would toss out 4-letter words. So Libel, who was she did not wear religion on her sleeve, but she was a very professional and genteel person. And she finally had it and said, Mario, we're going to have a quarter jar. And every time you swear, you're going to have to put a quarter in that jar. And that actually stopped Bagnoni from swearing in these meetings that had been driving Pat crazy. But usually had a very good sense of she would, Tullio had a weight problem his entire life. And Pat would try to keep candy and chocolate away from him. That was one of her main duties, I think, as the chief of staff. But of course, he would go around the 5th floor and beg candy and chocolate off of anybody. So Pat finally, probably in exhaustion, she starts freezing blueberries and walnuts and bringing him in and putting him into that refrigerator that used to be in the back of Lou's office in a closet. I think finally, since they left Joyce was so little when they escaped office. I don't know if you ever saw the refrigerator, but that was the kind of person she was. But I'm going on too long. I just wanted to give you a taste of how great she was. And my brother Kevin wrote a really nice column item about Pat when she died in October. I'm just going to pull it up here. He said, here it is. Pat was Tullio's gatekeeper, his sounding board, and his most trusted aide. For reporters covering City Hall, if Pat liked you, you were golden. If not, you had to beg for scraps of information from lowly subordinates. Although that's a shot at subordinates. I got my best stories from subordinates. He must have been an even worse reporter. Libel had power and class. And that is absolutely correct. She was classy. And over the years, she was so smart. And he concluded with, she would never claim this, but she was a major player in Erie politics for more than a generation. And that's exactly true. And that's the Art Logan, Lou Tullio, and then on her own. She went on to become the first president of the Erie Chamber, and she was just a leader in her own right. So,
I appreciate that, Pat, and I think there's plenty we take away from there. Her innovative approach to problem solving, whether it's freezing blueberries or busting out a swear tip jar, and also her loyal nature and the power of being a gatekeeper. I appreciate that, and those are things I want to come back to in that discussion. I want to turn now to Edwin McKean. One of the things that we might be familiar with when we think back on the Tullio administration is some dealings with the IRS, and Pat Liebel played a critical role in that. And Ed, you had a firsthand account of that, so I'm going to ask you to share that, share your reflections, your recollections with us now.
Well, I never met Pat Liebel until 1973, when I was hired by the mayor to represent him in a tax investigation that was initiated by the Internal Revenue Service. And the investigation was in the hands of the criminal agency of the Internal Revenue Service. And I met Pat almost immediately after Mayor Tullio retained me. And I discovered a few things early on. First off, Mayor Tullio's first wife, Seal, had died in, I believe, 1969. And they'd had a long love affair, those two people, I came to learn. And at the time following her death, he was going through difficult times, as you might imagine, and at the same time attempting to run the city. And during that period, Pat became sort of his alter ego when it came to his personal affairs. She took over all of his record keeping, all of his financial affairs and so forth. And she is a person who I worked with more than the mayor during a tax investigation. The investigation went on for 5 years, if you can imagine that. And the primary focus of it was on what is called a net worth analysis. And that means, in very simple terms, is if you imagine starting your calendar year with a net worth of $100,000 and ending the year with a net worth of $200,000 and reflecting on your tax return an income of $50,000, you're $50,000 short. So it's your obligation, once the government shows that you have this discrepancy, it's your obligation to come forward with the reasons for the discrepancy and to identify non-taxable sources of money to fill that gap. For example, it might be an inheritance, it might be a gift, and so forth. Well, the other element to that is that the investigation, since it's a criminal investigation, it covers 6 years of your tax life. And if you imagine trying to reconstruct your financial life over a period of 6 years, even for most of us that have uncomplicated financial lives, if you had to look at your bank account and say, what was that deposit for? Where did that money come from? Or I wrote this check to so-and-so, what was it for? And so on. Well, it's very, very difficult to reconstruct. And had it not been for Pat's diligence, we would have never been able to do it. And in the process of her work on his behalf with respect to his personal affairs, came to my attention that she did none of that activity, performed none of those services during regular business hours at City Hall. She did all of her record keeping for the mayor after the workday was complete, and she did it at her home. The city never paid for any of the activities of Pat Liebel insofar as her services on behalf of the mayor were concerned. So the first quality that came to mind to me and has stayed with me is Pat's personal integrity. She was a person of enormous self-respect, and the idea of doing something that would compromise herself was just out of the question. She just wouldn't do that. So I came to rely on her in the investigation more than the mayor. The mayor was essentially of no use to me, really, in the investigation. It was all Pat. She dug through every record. She dug through every piece of paper over a period of 6 years in order to satisfy the Revenue Service. And we got to one point towards the end when we had a very large bank deposit that we couldn't identify. And I asked Lou every day over a period of weeks, Lou, what is that deposit for? Where did it come from? And he couldn't answer. He said, I have no idea what that is. And Pat dug and dug and dug and dug. And she called me one day and she said, I think I know what it is. And she went into the basement in Lou's house and she unwrapped these old boxes that were all dust covered and so on. And she discovered that the boxes were filled with, I guess, what are called prayer cards. When Lou's first wife died, people would come and express their condolences, and they would present a card, and they often would put money in them, in the card, to assist the family with whatever the needs were. And someone, we never really learned who, sat down and marked on the card the amount of money that had been contained in it. And when Pat found these things, she sat down and added them all up. And the exact total of all those cards came to the exact total of that bank deposit. That ended the investigation. Once I showed that to the revenue officer, I said, look, here it is. That was money that was gifted to Mayor Tullio from ordinary people around the city of Erie at the time of his first wife's death. And here's the deposit and here are the cards. And it was shortly after that that we got a letter from the Revenue Service notifying us that the investigation had terminated. Without Pat, it would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible, to reconstruct the mayor's financial life over the period of 6 years that was being investigated. She was diligent. She was tireless in her determination to identify everything that was of importance to me in representing Lou in that investigation. So I developed a considerable respect for her. And I also witnessed her in action in the mayor's office on many occasions, because I would go down to the city hall to sit with the mayor and go over his affairs. And she would be present most of the time because she knew more about things than he did. Well, it was like being the proverbial fly on the wall. I had the opportunity of witnessing Lou meeting with every political leader in the city and a great many of the business leaders of the city, bankers and so forth, and watching that interaction. And I also witnessed the mayor turning to her after the meeting would be over, and he would say to her, "What's your reaction?" And she would tell him what she thought. And I would sit there and think to myself, she's right. She was right every time. She had pinpointed each and every one of these people, very shrewd about folks. And as a consequence, the mayor was served not only with respect to his personal affairs, but he was served extremely well in terms of his political life by this woman who had been with him for so many years. And one last thing about her that I'd like to mention, she had a great sense of humor. She could find something to laugh about under the most difficult circumstances. And I, as a consequence, enjoyed being with her at all times. And our friendship, which developed as a result of that investigation, continued for years afterwards. So that's my feeling about Pat Liebel.
Ed, and I really appreciate that. And there's so much that we picked up on threads from what other people had said. We see those character traits emerging, and we see that consistency and continuity over that. I appreciate that. Plenty to come back to in discussion. I want to thank you, and now I want to turn over to Mayor Joyce. Joyce Savocchio, you had shared time overlapping while you were on City Council and with the Tullio administration, and of course Pat Liebel being there. Then, of course, there was both of your bids to become the first elected woman mayor of the city of Erie. And there were some interesting stories that came out during those campaigns. So take us back there, Mayor Joyce, if you can, your reflection.
Well, first of all, I identify with what so many of the other panelists have said. So if there's a little bit of repetition, we're all coming to that same woman. And it's appropriate that we're doing it. Too often we focus on elected officials, and so often the people that work with and for and beside elected officials are in themselves tremendous civic leaders and committed people to community service, and certainly she was that. I knew of Pat Liebel, of course, but never really had direct contact with her as such. And then I went on to City Council. I had seen Pat in social settings before because of the political arena many times, and she knew politics. And as was indicated before by Pat, she grew up in politics. So she knew it well. And so we would have, casual conversations, but to really know her, I didn't. And that took place when I was elected to City Council. And being the first woman elected to City Council, it was kind of foreign territory for everyone. I can remember the first night that I went to a council meeting and we were in caucus, the thing that was on my mind, I said, please, dear God, don't let any of my fellow council members in this caucus room ask me to make coffee. I don't want that to be my first challenge as a woman. But I took great comfort in the fact that Pat Liebel was there. She was obviously, as somebody had referred to her, I believe it was Pat, she was his chief of staff, and you knew that. And so we got to know each other that way. I think where we got to know in during those years, in fact, it was the first year I served on City Council. We both attended, along with Tullio, the Mondale Ferraro convention. I hate to date it, it was in 1981, but we went there. And as a result, it gave Pat and I a chance to get to know each other more on a personal basis. Conventions, as Judy knows, we have gone to conventions together, can be very hectic things and you need your space sometime. And so there were times when we could kind of get away and have a cup of coffee. And in those times, we really did talk about each other, our families and so forth. And you began to get a stronger sense about the woman. And believe me, she was a very special person, very committed to her family, very committed to her church and her beliefs. Then as time went on, as no one could have predicted, Mayor Tullio got, as was indicated, very ill and was not seeking re-election. And there we were, Pat and I, both running as opponents in the primary. And it made perfect sense that she would run. I think Mayor Tullio wanted her to. I think she wanted to. I think part of it was to preserve the Tullio legacy, and rightly so. And in a way, it was unfortunate that it had to be that moment that she and I would be opponents, but not opponents in the sense of hard-hitting political opponents. There was always a very good relationship between the two of us as we ran for office. And there was one thing that came up that was just an unbelievable thing to both of us. There was a rumor going around, and in Erie at that time, not everything broke in the news as breaking news. And excuse me, Pat, in all due respect, as we see now in New York Times and so forth. So there was like an underground rumor going around that Pat and I were cousins, which I couldn't put together at all. I mean, how on earth could we be cousins? She was as Irish as you could get, and I was as Italian as you could get. So somewhere along the line, something had to happen. And at first I took it, with a grain of salt and laughed. And then I thought, I'm going to call her. And I called her and we talked, and we kind of came to the conclusion that whoever had planted that rumor, for some strange reason, felt that it would cause a loss for either Pat or myself or both of us. And so we decided we were going to have a press conference. And we did. I think that was probably the strangest press conference during an election season that you ever had, that you had two opponents denying they were cousins. And we laughed about it. I think even the media at the time that was doing it laughed. And it was something that kind of continued through the years. Every once in a while, we would say, hi, cuz, and laugh. So it was a time, I think, that was an interesting time that showed that you could be opponents and you could get along. She was a woman of great character and poise, and that showed all the way through. The next time that we really came together in a very different way was I became mayor-elect. And there had to be a transition. And I knew it was a difficult time, not just for me and my team in transition, but for Pat. It was mentioned earlier that Mayor Tullio had resigned, and in those closing months, she was acting mayor, certainly capable. I mean, if there was a person who was prepared to be mayor, it was Pat. But she had to take that on, and take that on in an environment where a man that she had worked with, partnered with, helped all these years, and indeed personal friends, was on a final journey of his life. And so all of those things were there for her to deal with. And then she had to deal with a mayor-elect in transition. I give her a lot of credit for that because she did it very well. She was very, very helpful. If you sought advice, she never gave things as advice. She would make them as suggestions. And that was the right way to do it. So it certainly eased the transition point during a time that I know was especially difficult for her. But I think what I admire her most for is that while she, through most of her lifetime, had lived in the political arena, she didn't identify herself with that. And she didn't identify herself just with the Tullio administration. She, I honestly saw and believe, was her own person. And I'm very happy that when the time came to leave City Hall, she could do that. She reinvented herself. And with her position at Mercyhurst, she became director of alumni affairs. And I found that wonderful, that she could do that. And I'm sure she felt that way too, because she herself was an alumna of Mercyhurst. So I knew she would bring everything to it, and she did. She really gave her whole life to public and civic service. But she also was very committed to her family and to her church. And I think that she was a real, almost a woman before her time. She set an example, I think, for women, not only of her generation, but for those young women of today. And so she should be remembered. And she should be remembered, really, I believe, for her leadership role in this community.
And Mayor Joyce, I want to thank you for that. And I think, what a wonderful and beautiful segue, using that reinvention idea of going beyond politics. And I think we have two great examples here of political officials that have had a very active life after politics in both you and Judy. And we thank you both for that. And we see the same with Pat Liebel. And so I do want to turn over to Sheila Coon here to talk about Pat's life and legacy and her time at Mercyhurst University. Sheila, tell us about your experiences and your reflection.
Thank you, Ben. And this is a tough act to follow, folks, but I'll do my best. Pat Liebel was the only daughter of the late Arthur and Margaret Mahoney Liebel, and she was fiercely proud of her Irish and German ancestry. She loved her parents and her brothers dearly, and all her nieces and nephews and her cousins, especially Patty and Paul Sacco in Northeast, and she spoke about them all very often. As it was mentioned earlier, she graduated from Jefferson Elementary and then Academy High School, and then Mercyhurst College with a bachelor's degree in business in 1953. And as Dr. Lynch mentioned, when her boss Lou Tullio was elected mayor in the fall of 1965, he asked her to go with him to City Hall. She was at the school district at the time. She thought about the offer, and then she pointedly reminded him that if he were to lose the next election, she too would be out of a job, and she wasn't sure she wanted to do that. Well, he finally convinced her, obviously, and for 25 years, she served the city of Erie as Tullio's executive assistant, then business administrator, and finally as acting mayor, as Mayor Savocchio just mentioned. But at Mercyhurst in 1986, before her term at the city was up, Mercyhurst was celebrating its 60th anniversary, and they recognized Pat with a Special Achievement Award for her career accomplishments in public office. And 2 years later, again, they honored Pat as as Mercyhurst's distinguished alumni. So for nearly a quarter of a century, Pat served Erie under Mayor Tullio. And in reading the book, Lou Tullio, A Real Erie Guy by Corey Valancourt, I was struck by the fact that there were 26 pages of quotes that were attributed to Pat Liebel. And as you've heard this afternoon, Pat's work was significant and vital at the city. But sadly, after Mayor Tullio died, Dr. Garvey, then president of Mercyhurst College, reached out to Pat and asked her to return to her alma mater as the director of alumni relations. And she never looked back. As Joyce said, she was able to reinvent herself. She had the incredible ability to live in the moment and to make the most out of any situation. During her 20-year tenure at Mercyhurst, the alumni department evolved into the advancement department and grew from 2 people on the staff to more than 12. And outreach to alumni really began in earnest. And it started with a simple, gracious letter from Pat inviting alumni to return to the college for homecoming. Alumni luncheons were then planned, and gatherings were planned throughout the Northeast. So she was on the road all the time, and faculty speakers were invited, and Pat attended nearly every event that Mercyhurst ever held. And for the first time, alumni gifts to the college supporting the endowment began to flow. I returned to Mercyhurst in 2007 after leaving the Erie Times News, and that's where I met Pat again. I had met her earlier, but really didn't have, like Joyce, I didn't have a whole lot of interaction with her early on. But at that point, I had a life-changing privilege of working alongside of her and learning from her. She knew nearly every alumni by that point, and she could tell you each person's story, where they lived, where they worked, and their children's names. And the history of Mercyhurst College was really woven into Pat's history. She knew and loved the Sisters of Mercy dearly, and she was so grateful for the education they gave her. Several times a year, she could be found up at the Mother House, often to spend time with one of her favorite classmates, Sister Bernadette Bell, who told me just recently, it was strange, even though we were classmates, me, a resident, and Pat, a day hop, we never were really close until I returned to Erie in a leadership role at the Sisters of Mercy. And after that, we would get together frequently for lunch with our classmates, and often it was just the two of us. I remember how Pat loved Mercyhurst and was so loyal, and how highly she always spoke of Lou Tullio and her years working with him. I do miss her, but I hold happy memories of these past years, Sister Bernadette said. And Pat could be found at nearly every one of the sisters' fundraisers over the years. She was truly loyal to the sisters and to Mercyhurst. And she attended almost every funeral that the Sisters of Mercy held for one of their own, until her own health failed and she could no longer drive. So during the 10 years that Pat and I worked together, we would often go off campus for lunch. She was so gracious, but she had to drive. She was in charge of driving, and she had to pay for her own meal. There was no arguing. And I learned so much about her life and her interests, and even the road trip that she and Grace Tullio took across the country one winter. It was a pretty harrowing experience from what she said. She also told me how she helped Grace organize and bring photos and gifts and other articles that were presented to Mayor Tullio during his time in office to the archives at Mercyhurst in the Tullio conference room on the 4th floor of Hammermill Library. And Pat tended all of those archived materials with great stewardship. But it wasn't until I read her obituary in October that I learned about her other accolades and awards from the Chamber of Commerce and the Erie County Democratic Women's Council, and even the prestigious Liberty Bell Award from the Erie County Bar Association. She was active at St. Peter Cathedral, and she served on diocesan committees and on the board of the Pennsylvania Catholic Conference. Her faith was very important to Pat. In 1996, Pope John Paul II named her a Lady of St. Gregory the Great. And in 2012, like many of the panel members here, when Bishop Lawrence T. Persico was installed as the new bishop of the Diocese of Erie, Pat was also invited. And she most graciously asked me to join her for the installation service at St. Peter Cathedral and the reception that followed. Erie political leaders, Catholic business owners, and religious dignitaries from throughout the 13 counties of the Diocese of Erie attended. And so many people recognized Pat immediately and wanted to speak with her. I was struck by how poised she was and how genuine she was. She never missed a beat, and she warmly acknowledged each person by name and asked about their families and reminded each of a special memory she had of them. As many people know, Pat's health caused her major challenges, but she was a fighter. And by the time she moved to St. Mary's East, I would visit her on Fridays. We would laugh and we would always pray the Hail Mary together. She was pretty much bound to the wheelchair by then, but she was as sharp as a tack. And she would speak about the news and always ask for an update on my family or our mutual friends. And she was delighted that Father Malthaner would visit her each month from St. Luke, as well as her family and her lifelong friends like Penny Haynes and Brady Lewis, and colleagues like Jeanette Britt and Kathy Richardson and Ryan Palm from Mercyhurst. What was most surprising to me, and I guess it probably shouldn't be because I knew Pat so well, but 3 years ago on a Sunday night, my home phone rang, and it was Pat. She was calling from St. Mary's to wish me good luck the following morning with my surgery. And I said, "Oh, Pat, how kind of you to remember me." And she said, "Sheila, this is not about me." She was very stern. "It's about you. And I want you to know that everything is going to be okay. And I look forward to seeing you when you are well enough to return and visit with me." And I did that until COVID-19 happened, sadly. I have to tell you, knowing Pat and becoming her friend is a most treasured gift in my life. Throughout her life, she made thousands of acquaintances and gathered hundreds of loyal friends. Her life so well lived, her leadership and her kindness was a wonderful gift to Mercyhurst and to the hundreds of us in Erie and throughout the country that were fortunate enough to have known and met Pat Liebel. Thank you.
Sheila, I want to thank you for that, and it warms my heart. I'm sure it will yours as well. There's an alumni gathering happening in the comment section of this Facebook post where we're live right now, and people are reflecting on the impact that she had had in their life and welcoming them back to the university and building that connection and restoring that. So certainly she had a lasting impact. People are reflecting there. Second, I'll lead in with echoing what somebody else has already said in the comment section, which is great presentations all. I really do thank you. This has been a fantastic look at the life and legacy of Pat Liebel. And I want to open it for some conversation here at the end and pick up on some of the threads that we discussed. And one of the things, Mayor Joyce, you talked about having to hold a joint press conference to acknowledge that the two of you were in fact not related, despite a rumor happening, and giving us a little bit of levity there as you called each other cuz as you passed each other on the streets and in life following that. But we do have a family connection on the panel here, and that's what I want to turn to for our first follow-up in conversation to Judy Lynch here. Dr. Lynch, you did have a connection through your family to Pat Liebel. Tell us about that.
Yes, this is the connection through my husband, James Terrence Lynch, who is now no longer with us. But if he were here, he would be extraordinarily proud. And he would be one of the ones who would want to applaud the selection of Pat Liebel to be honored by the Jefferson. Pat's never married. Her name was Patricia Liebel. Her mother's name was Margaret Mahoney. And the Mahonies were one of the first Irish families not to come to the first ward, because we think of the first ward as being the Irish area, which it was. However, these were Irish families that were the first Irish families that came to Erie County. And this is at the beginning of the 1800s. And they established St. Philip's Church and St. James Cemetery. In fact, before the church was even constructed, there were masses that were being held in this area in 1798. Now, I'm not sure exactly when the Mahonies came, but they were one of these first Irish families. And my husband's family was also, this was not just the Lynches, but it was the Lehans and many others that were interrelated, like the McBrides. And so very proud. I think Pat was very proud of her Irish heritage. And she, of course, became a lady of St. Patrick's. And that was a way in which I could be with her to celebrate this Irish heritage. And I remember standing beside her and having her sing the blessing, the Irish blessing, and how clear her voice was and how forceful it was. So in my opinion, Pat Liebel was very proud to be at least in part Irish, but of course she was part German too.
Thank you for that, Judy. And one of the other things I want to pick up on, and Ed, you had mentioned this, and so I'd like to turn to Sheila and ask to hear her account of Pat's humor, because she was known as being a funny person. And Sheila, I was wondering what her humor later in life, post City Hall, might have looked like, because we heard about her having a swear jar for certain politicians while at City Hall. We also heard about her freezing some fruits to help Mayor Tullio keep down his weight. And we heard too, I think there's got to be some a good jocular nature in hosting a joint press conference to declare one's non-relations. But how about later in life at Mercyhurst? What did her sense of humor look like then?
Oh, well, her sense of humor was always kind of very dry. You never knew where it was coming from. And at the time, John Melody was on our staff, and he would have these wonderful Irish witticisms that he would just kind of blurt out at the staff meeting. And Pat would always have a comeback for him, and it would just crack everybody up. She never really took herself too seriously. She was definitely a leader. And if she felt you were walking off a cliff or heading off a cliff in some direction, she would very kindly make a suggestion, as Joyce had mentioned earlier, that maybe you don't want to do it that way, and then she would give you a reason why. But it was always kind, and then she would have something to leave you laughing at the end. So yeah, she was just a delight to work with.
Thank you for that, Sheila. And Mayor Joyce, I'm going to come back to you for a second. And I think that some people might say, as you were breaking glass ceilings, first on city council, and then running for mayor, and then Pat also running for mayor, there might be this idea of one of the two of you getting out of each other's way to then better support the other so that one might have a better chance of doing that, to which I think Pat Cuneo used the word baloney earlier. I would say the same thing, but it seemed like there was perhaps some camaraderie of supporting each other in trying to break through that frontier and keeping running, staying in the race, the both of you. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those conversations back and forth, knowing full well that one of you was potentially about to make history?
I think it wasn't just what was spoken. I think it was what was unspoken. We both understood that this was a very important moment, that there was, reason to believe, at least have hope, that one of us would be mayor. So I think that part of it was always there, but it never, in all the time, either on council or when we were opponents, it never really came up. It was just something that we felt. I think there was just genuine respect, and we knew, I think she certainly knew more than I did at the time, because she had served in government for so long, that it was a difficult challenge. And so often, I think in a way, she was a real pace setter. When you think that she, her entry into politics really started when she went into the school board. At one time, the saying in Erie was the most political place was the school board, not city hall and not county government. It was the school board, and it was tough. It was mentioned about Art Logan and so on. So she entered that world and she met it. I don't think she was uncomfortable in it. And I think that's what we probably had a great deal in common, was that I don't think either of us were really uncomfortable in it. We saw it for what it was, and yet it didn't interfere with any relationship that we had. And I think that was just an understanding that we had. I don't think there was a harsh word ever said between us. And so I hate to use this phrase, it's so overused, but I think it's real, is that it was a type of sisterhood. And I'll be quite honest, and I think it was with Judy and I. There was a sense of almost an immediate connection because of that. So I have a lot of good memories about that. And they're not just political, they become more personal.
I really appreciate that, Mayor Joyce. And Judy, I'll ask you to comment on that sisterhood, that feeling, because you've covered so many of these remarkable women in your series, and welcoming Pat Liebel into that sisterhood. I'd love to hear your comments on that feeling. It may, yes, be an overused word, but I think it's so applicable here.
Well, we have to remind ourselves that that March is the month of the woman, and we have been celebrating women in all types of pursuits. But it's interesting that women can collaborate, that they can form a kind of a sisterhood, or a way in which that they can work together to accomplish a goal. And I really think that maybe women are a little bit more effective at doing that than men have been traditionally or historically.
I appreciate that, Judy, and I think I'd agree with you. And I'd say that while it is Women's History Month, we should be celebrating all year long and year round of these accomplishments. And I want to thank you for your part in helping us to learn these stories and to helping us to cover these stories, and in this entire panel for doing that. As we're wrapping up here, and we heard a lot of words to describe Pat Liebel and her life and her legacy. I heard diligent, tireless. She was innovative in problem solving and so many other things. I'd love to go around and hear if you had to choose 3 words based on your interaction and on the reflection you gave us of Pat Liebel and her life and its impact on you and those around you and you worked with. I'd be curious what words you'd use to describe her now. Looking back on all that we've heard today, Mr. Pat Cuneo, can I start with you and what you would select in your 3 words and why?
Well, I would say smart, number 1, wicked smart. I guess that's an adjective with the
We'll hyphenate.
very kind and polite, unfailingly polite. And I saw, as part of this program, I went into the funeral home comments that people had left, and I was struck by how almost to a person there were scores of comments. They were not from public people or well-known people. And one woman, Tracy Eckelberger Uphold, I think it is, she talked about having worked at the switchboard at Old Main at Mercyhurst, and she said, Pat Liebel always said hello and goodbye every day. And I thought, well, doesn't that say it all?
Very touching. Mayor Joyce, can I go to you second? If you had to pick, and you could just go with one and put all the emphasis on that if you picked one, but 1 to 3 words that you would use to describe the life and legacy of Pat Liebel as we reflect on her.
Well, you know, of course, commitment. I mean, that's given. But beside that, I think her humanity, her connection with people, I think was very important. And it's important for all of us. But I think she demonstrated it throughout her life and throughout her work. And people saw that and responded to it.
I appreciate that, Mayor Joyce. Mr. Edwin McKean, if I can go over to you, what 3 words would you use to describe Pat Liebel's life and legacy?
Well, integrity overall. And that word would apply to her activities in all areas. In addition, diligence. She was a very hard worker. You could rely on her. If she said something was going to be done on a certain date, a certain time, why, you could bet money on it. It was going to happen. And loyalty. And I don't mean just to Tullio, to whom she was very loyal, but she was loyal to her friends. She was loyal to people in government. She was loyal to the average citizenry, to whom she took a great deal of interest. She got a lot of those calls that came into the mayor's office about garbage collection and all of the rest of the complaints that fall on into the mayor's office, as Joyce well knows. Pat handled those kinds of things with aplomb. She left people feeling that they were important. And, I frankly don't believe that under the best of circumstances, I could have handled that kind of thing day in and day out, all day long, the way she did, and have it come out right in the end. So those would be my 3 words.
I want to thank you for that, Ed. Sheila, I want to come to you. Your 3 words that you would use to describe the life and legacy of Pat Liebel.
All of the above, actually, but I think the one that comes to mind most prominently for me is Pat really embodied the mercy charism. It's a sense that from her soul outward, she was always merciful and always kind. She was wicked smart and committed and loyal and all of those things. But clearly her core, she was centered And she had a very, very strong faith, and she embodied the mercy charism as far as I can see.
I appreciate that, Sheila. And I wanted to save the final words here for Dr. Judith Lynch, without whom we would not have this series of both programs and publications. So Dr. Lynch, I want to thank you for that and for doing all the heavy lifting and putting this panel together for us. I called you, and before we knew it, you had people on the phone during our phone call to line this up. And so we're grateful for you, Dr. Lynch, all that you've done for this series, and then helping with this panel as well. So I want to give the final 3 words to you. Judy, what would you use to describe the life and legacy of Pat Liebel?
Well, it's my great pleasure to be participant number 1 and to salute Pat Liebel number 2. And number 3, I think we've already mentioned not probably all of the words, okay? And I particularly like what Sheila has said about the spiritual nature of Pat. I don't know that there's any higher kind of character that you can rise to than having that type of character. However, I would like to mention something that Mary Daly has said to me. And she said, above all, Pat was professional. And she was professional in every aspect of her work and also her dress. So one of the things that Mary had indicated to me is she popularized the blue suit, women wearing the blue suit. Remember, and Mary, and maybe Joyce can remember this, it seems like every time you saw Pat, she was always with kind of a white blouse with maybe a little bit of a bow tie, but with a blue suit. And so what Mary said is she popularized that professional appearance along with her professional comportment and her dealing with people in a very spiritual and aspirational way.
So wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Lynch, for that. I want to echo one of the comments from the comments section. We've got a lot of appreciation pouring in both for Pat and for this panel, saying thank you to the panel. She had meant so much to so many, and that this person appreciates keeping her spirit alive with this program. I'll add the words classy, conscientious, smart, tactful, loyal, beloved are just a few of the words this one person would use to describe Pat Liebel as well. And I want to conclude on a comment by our own president, Dr. Ferki Ferrati, who really came up with the idea and spark of this program of including the life and legacy of Pat Liebel in this series and put us to task, our team at the JES. I want to thank all of our team members. Wouldn't be possible without them to do this, but this is a great conversation about a fantastic person whom he had the pleasure of meeting at Mercyhurst as well. Many had that pleasure. Many had that opportunity to work with her. We've learned a lot about the life and legacy. We've left a lot on the table, which we can come back to in future programming. But I want to say, Judy, Joyce, Sheila, Ed, and Pat, thank you all so very, very, very much for sharing your insight into the life and legacy of Erie's Pat Liebel here in conversation. And to our viewers, all of you weighing in on the comments section, all of you watching, whether you tune in live to this JES broadcast on our Facebook page, or you're streaming on demand a later broadcast or listening to it, thank you, thank you, thank you. Without you, these programs aren't possible. Thank you, the viewers. And of course, a friendly reminder to stream other JES digital programs on demand. Head over to our website, jeserie.org. There you're also going to find details about upcoming JES programs, as well as a wide range of publications from quick, timely reads to reports to essays and so much more, all available free to download. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society and on behalf of our illustrious, esteemed panel and for the life and legacy of Pat Liebel, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Ben Speggen. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.